When I was invited to be present with you this afternoon, a number of things happened which I must narrate to you before I advert to the subject that I have been invited to speak about. The first thing that happened is that I was told that I have to speak on the subject of globalization and the challenges and opportunities that it provides for Africa. Perhaps if I'd been given the latitude, I would have chosen another subject. But in his wisdom, the Vice Chancellor, and I want to believe the university administration, thought that that was what I have to talk about. And I want to be a good guest here at Bells University. I will therefore speak on that subject. The second thing that happened is that I was invited and told a few days in advance that I had to submit a copy of my speech. And I said that ordinarily I write my speeches when I've delivered them. Now that you are telling me to write one in advance, what will I do? Once again, in the spirit of being a good guest, I said I would only provide an outline of my speech. Therefore, if you have been given an outline of my speech and you expect that that is what I'm going to say, God save you. Be that as it may, permit me now to speak about a subject that is very topical: globalization. You know, when one is asked to address an august assembly such as this, one is likely to go deep into looking for the meaning of globalization. I refuse to do so. I refuse to do so because I believe that my audience is an enlightened audience. I refuse to do so because globalization is like the proverbial elephant. An attempt at defining it will only cause confusion. Because I am told those who touch the legs of the elephant thought it was a tree trunk. Those who touched its ears thought it was another thing. But suffice it to say that when we talk about globalization today, we are likely to mean an environment where goods and services are sold and are dealt with as if there were no borders. That is what globalization may mean today. And one may ask the fundamental question: is this the first time that we have globalization, particularly when we talk about Africa? I think not. I hold the view that Africa has over the years been the victim of globalization. I was reading a book written by a Sierra Leone with the title Orpoto. In that book he narrates the history of slavery. He talks about how the Portuguese, the Spaniards, later the Dutch, the English, the Germans, and the Italians came to the continent of Africa and took away able-bodied young men and women and spirited them into Europe and America and into the Caribbean. And I ask myself, was that not globalization in its embryonic stages? Then I ask myself, when slavery had lost its attraction and we were colonized, at that time the European powers did not need any visas to come to Africa. Instead, they assembled in Berlin in Germany between 1884 and 1885, and they divided Africa into several little enclaves which now are the countries that we live in 55 in number. And I ask myself, was that not globalization? And I also ask myself, when during the colonial period they came to Africa and took away gold from Ghana, they took away minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo, they grew and took away coffee and tea from Kenya, they took uranium from Niger, they took diamond and gold from South Africa, they took diamond from Sierra Leone, Liberia. I ask myself, is that and was that not globalization? So that what one is seeing and what one sees when one looks throughout history is that Africa has always been the victim and the target of globalization. And one may say that it is our resistance of globalization that led to the struggle for independence, so that when we regained our independence as independent African countries, we were actually resisting globalization as had been marketed to us through slavery and colonization. I remember so very distinctly on the 6th day of March 1957, when Ghana had regained her independence, and the then president of Ghana, the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, was given the opportunity to address Ghanaians. He reminded them ever so passionately and eloquently that the independence of Ghana meant nothing if the rest of Africa was not free. He was acutely aware, as he said during that speech and subsequently, that the death of colonization only meant the birth of neocolonization. He reminded his audience that there was a new and technology had to be given her pride of place. A few years later, not only Ghana was free, but other African countries were free. But when I use the word free, let us not run ahead of ourselves. I use the word free to mean that when we regained our independence, we were able to manage our political affairs. I use the word free that when we regained our independence, we designed our own flags. I use the word free to mean that when we regained our independence, we were able to compose and sing our own national anthems. But those who interrogate and interrogate deeply would pose the question, were we really free? That question was to be posed in 1963. In the month of May in 1963, 32 heads of states and governments assembled in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. There were two schools of thought on that day. The first school was the school that recognized that Africa, divided into little states as she was weak and vulnerable to the diabolical machinations of the former colonizers. That school was led by Kwame Nkrumah. There was another school. That school believed that Africa could unite, but they believed that the unity could be gradual. That school held the view that it was not possible for Africa to unite as she desired. One of the leading torchbearers of that school was Tanzania's Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. There was a competition of those schools. And when the competition ended, the school that was gradually headed by Julius Kambarage Nyerere had carried the day, and instead of a United States of Africa, we had an Organization of African Unity. On that day, with one committee of ministers, with a capital of Africa in Bangui in Central African Republic, they listened to him not. Several years later, Tanzania's Julius Kambarage Nyerere was to say, in 1997, when he had seen the weakness of African countries, Kwame Nkrumah was right, we were wrong. If only we had united then. That is the Africa that we talk about today. An Africa which, when others refer to her, they still refer to her as if she was an extension of her former colonizers. They still refer to Africa as Anglophone, to mean English-speaking countries. Even Nigeria is Anglophone, notwithstanding that not more than 20% of Nigerians actually speak English. In Senegal, they are referred to as the Francophone, notwithstanding that not more than 20% of them speak French. In Mozambique and Angola, they refer to them as Lusophone, and I'm told they also refer to some of them as Arabophone. Africa is a continent that is always being referred to by others in names that she does not participate in choosing. But even if that were not so, Africa has also suffered the fate of being defined by others. When it was convenient to Europe and America, they referred to us as the third world. When the third world was not so sweet after all, they referred to us as underdeveloped countries. And when underdeveloped country was not sweet either, they referred to us as developing countries. We are always defined and referred to others by terms that are meant to silence us and paralyze us so that we do not appreciate what we are doing. I and you will remember that when African countries regained independence, all of them, all the leaders had clarity of mind. Even the ones that later changed and became monsters were clear in their mind. Sometimes, when I look at Africa from west to east, and I listen to the speeches that were made then, if you cared to listen to Leopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, or Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, he was clear that Africa had to solve our problems of disease and hunger and ignorance. But it's not only Houphouët-Boigny that was clear, or Senghor. Modibo Keïta was clear in Mali, as Amadou Ahidjo was clear in Cameroon. Here in Nigeria, you may or may not agree, but when I listen to the speeches at that time of Nnamdi Azikiwe, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, and even the Sultan of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, their clarity of mind on what Nigeria needed could not be contradicted even if you did not agree with them. When I go to Congo, the man for whom I am named was as clear as Christo Patrice Emery Lumumba. Even David Dacko in Central African Republic was clear, although he later turned into some kind of monster. But clarity was the watchword in those early days. When you went to East Africa, so clear was Apollo Milton Obote, Jomo Kenyatta, and Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And you went a little down, even Kamuzu Banda was clear, as was Kaunda. There was unanimity that Africa became independent so that she could solve our problems. But no sooner had we settled or started settling in our independence way than we started experiencing problems. First, the machinations of our erstwhile colonizers, the leaders who had clarity of mind, were removed. Sylvanus Olympio was no more in Togo. Modibo Keïta was no more in Mali. In 1966, Osagyefo himself was no more in Ghana. Here in Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe was no more. The Sultan of Sokoto and the Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa were no more and paid the ultimate price. Africa was bleeding. Coup d'etats became the thing in Africa, and those who did not love Africa even said that coups were as frequent as breakfast in Africa, but I dare say that even breakfast did not exist on African tables. That is the Africa that we are talking about. An Africa that apparently regained independence but was still controlled from elsewhere. And there is something that you must acknowledge about the erstwhile colonizers. Even when they appear to let you become freedom, they create a body in which they claim that you are equal and free, but equality and freedom is never there. So all former British colonies are still part of the Commonwealth, where they are free, independent, and equal, but the Queen is the permanent head. The former French colonies also exist in a body that is run from France. The former Portuguese colonies also find themselves in that way. The umbilical cord between us and the colonizers was never cut. And when we try to cut it, we realize that the umbilical cord is made of steel. And when we bring tools to cut it, they create a bypass so that we are always linked. That is the reality of Africa. So that today when we talk about globalization, we ask ourselves, is Africa ready for globalization? Is Africa ready for the fourth industrial revolution, they ask? Africa existed during the first industrial revolution in 1760. The world at that time merely meant Europe, went through the industrial revolution when they migrated from agriculture and they started using equipment and they were mechanized. That happened in Europe, it happened in the United States of America, it happened in Japan, and we are told that we missed the first industrial revolution. There was the second industrial revolution, where they were not just using the machines, but they had graduated a little. They were using not just steam engine, but even the steam itself was being used. We are told we missed the second industrial revolution. In the 1950s, when there was the third industrial revolution, with the world of digitization, we are told that we missed the third industrial revolution. We are now told that there is the fourth industrial revolution and that we must participate in it when we talk about robotics, when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about the Internet of Things. We are told that Africa must participate, and that is another name for globalization. Is it a good thing, this thing called globalization? This thing called globalization means several things. It means, among other things, that our markets must now be open to the world. It means, among other things, that we have become equals in the world and that we can participate. But before I talk about that equality, permit me to take you through recent history of how Africa has been treated. I remember in 1970s and 1980s, the Europeans sat in Europe, and in their magnanimity, because they are ever magnanimous, in quotes and quotes, they took the view that Africans and the Caribbeans and the Pacific needed an arrangement where their problems of poverty, hunger, and climate change ought to be addressed. And they sat down and in 1975 came up with the Lomé Convention signed in Togo. The Lomé Convention ran its course and Africa did not change. When the Lomé Convention had run its circle in the year 2000, They sat again in Cotonou in Benin and came again with the Cotonou Convention. And once again it ran its course, and the Cotonou Convention did not give birth to anything. In 1980, the World Bank and the IMF, the so-called Bretton Woods institution, sat in New York and said that Africans needed something called structural adjustment. Africa is always the laboratory of new ideas that are conceived by European economists in European universities, and they came here with structural adjustment programs, and they told government, you have no business being in business. African governments listened to them, and whether you are in Nigeria or in Nairobi, Kenya, or in Accra, Ghana, or in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, there was only one eloquent voice being heard from London, England, and from Washington, D.C., and from Paris, France, telling us, sell all your assets, sell your telecom companies, sell your power companies. We sold them, and they did not perform, and they went back to think of yet another experiment, and I suspect that that experiment is globalization. Why do I suspect that that experiment could be globalization? Because the Western world is never asleep. I remember under the aegis of the United Nations, and the United Nations is a good thing. But remember that when the United Nations organization was created in 1945 in San Francisco in the United States of America, none of the African countries were independent. We were not there. And remember that when they constituted the United Nations, they created something called the Security Council, and no African country sits at the Security Council. Remember that the world is structured in such a way that meetings are held in the world. The first meeting that is normally held is the G7. They were G8 until they expelled Russia. Now they are the G7. When they meet in Davos or they meet in Glen Eagles in Scotland, the 7 leaders of the most powerful economies in the world meet. Occasionally they invite the president of Nigeria because it is the most populous nation in Africa. Occasionally they invite the president of South Africa because it has a large economy, and they also invite the chairman for the time being of African Union. And the first and the last time that you see those presidents is at the photo op. After they have taken the photo on the first day, they are told, you go home. You go home. That is meeting number 1, the G7. Then there is another meeting of the G20. The G20 is a meeting where a few African countries may find themselves. Nigeria finds ourselves there. South Africa finds ourselves there. Occasionally Egypt finds ourselves there. Sometimes Algeria finds ourselves there, but their participation is minimal. Then there is another meeting of the rest, which all the 54 African countries belong to. I am submitting to us that at the dinner table where serious things are discussed, Africa is always under the table picking the crumbs and assuming that the party is under the table while the real party is on the table. I'm submitting to us that when we talk about globalization, we must ask ourselves, could globalization mean what I'm suggesting it means? But let us ask ourselves, when we talk about the challenges and the promises of globalization, let us ask ourselves what it is that we are talking about. When we talk about globalization, we are saying that the world has become one. We are saying, as the great South Korean writer Ha Jun Chang has written in his book, The Bad Samaritans, we are saying that globalization means that when an item is produced in China, that item should find its way in Nouakchott in Mauritania without any barriers. We are saying that when we talk about globalization, there is one market. We are saying that when we talk about globalization, our borders disappear. We are saying that when we talk about globalization, we are talking about the dissolution of borders, and we are talking about the death of time, because technology now allows us almost to travel instantaneously. The question is Africa prepared for that thing? You know, several years ago, in 1980 to be exact, the former Tanzanian President Julius Kambarage Nyerere was asked the question, do you believe that African countries should play as equal players in the world economic arena? Because Europe and America now say, after the WTO rules, that the rules and the field has been made level. This is what Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere said. He said that in boxing, the boxers are divided into several categories. There are heavyweight boxers, there are light heavyweight boxers, there are bantamweight boxers, there are featherweight boxers, but the rules of boxing are the same. If you take a heavyweight boxer and put him in the same ring with a lightweight on the argument that the rules are the same, that is not boxing, that is murder. I am submitting to us that whenever we are told that the rules are the same, we are being invited to commit suicide. Because, ladies and gentlemen, tell me, if the President of the United States of America, whose economy has a GDP of $14 trillion, invites the President of Burundi, whose GDP is $2 billion, for a bilateral agreement, even if there are 21 gun salutes, even if there is a red carpet, it is not a meeting of equals. That is the reality. And yet we are being told that the United States of America is a sovereign state, and Burundi is a sovereign state, and I agree. I'm being told that Germany is a sovereign state, and Sao Tome and Principe is also a sovereign state. I'm being told that Benin is a sovereign state, and France is also a sovereign state, and therefore they are meeting on an equal and a level playing field. If Africa is invited to such a boxing match, and Africa is not one, sometimes Africa is presented as if it was a single country. No, it is not. I am therefore submitting to us that we must interrogate ourselves whenever we are told that the field is level. But there is something unique about Africa. Why do I say there is something unique about Africa? People are always meeting about Africa to define Africa and to define what Africa needs. They met in Berlin in 1884 and divided Africa. They never stopped there. Today, everybody is meeting about Africa. The Chinese meet in Beijing, and they invite our leaders to Beijing. Why are they inviting us? Is it because they love us so much? I doubt. Why is it that once China has invited us to Beijing, Japan also invites us to Tokyo? Is it because we are so beautiful that we are loved by everybody? I doubt. Why is it that once we have been invited to Japan, we are also invited to Washington? Is it because we are so beautiful that nobody can resist us? Why is it that when Washington has finished with us, Europe also invites us to Brussels? Are we so beautiful that we cannot be resisted? And why are we so beautiful that even Russia now invites us? Are we so beautiful that the next person to invite us will be the Arab countries in Doha, in Qatar? We must ask ourselves why we are being invited. As you are asking yourself, I know why we are being invited. We are being invited because Africa is the home of the things that everybody wants. Everybody knows that Africa has all the things that are desirable. And if you doubted that Africa had everything, you start to look at your African map. If you want gold, you go to Johannesburg, South Africa. In fact, the other name of Johannesburg is Igoli, which means gold. If you want diamond, you climb a little and go to Namibia and to Botswana and to Lesotho, and you find diamond there. And if you want uranium, you just go to Zimbabwe. And if you are tired of looking at uranium in Zimbabwe, you climb the ladder a little and you go to Zambia and you are confronted with copper. And if you are tired of copper, just rise to the Democratic Republic of Congo and you'll ask yourself the question, what was God thinking when he created Congo? What mineral is not there? Everything is in Congo except nothing. That is Africa for you. And when you move out of Congo, you go to the armpit of Africa. As if things can only be hidden in the armpit, you find oil in Equatorial Guinea and you find oil in Angola. And as if oil was condemned to reside in that part of the world, you find oil off the shores of Gabon. You find oil off the shores of Benin. You find oil off the shores of Cameroon. You find oil off the shores of Nigeria. You find oil off the shores of Ghana. And if you are tired of oil and you now want to go into agriculture, you go to Ghana, and when you are looking for cocoa and before you see cocoa, you meet gold. And if you rise a little up there, you go to Cote d'Ivoire, you meet cocoa. And if you are tired of West Africa and you go to West Africa, come to my Kenya, you meet tea, you meet coffee, and you go to Tanzania and to Ethiopia. What did God not put in Africa? That is the continent that everybody wants. That is the continent that they say must now embrace globalization. That is the continent that they now say that continent must open our borders. We know it when they tell us to open our borders, and we are being told that is a game of recalls. I refuse to accept. You know, I do not claim the monopoly of knowledge or wisdom, but I know a few things. And one of the things that I know is what globalization should not mean. I know two things, what globalization should not mean and what globalization should not mean. Globalization should not mean that when fish is produced in China, the fish should be marketed in my rural village in Kenya to the detriment of our fishermen. If that is what globalization, we must reject globalization. I refuse to believe that when globalization means that when I want to take a taxi in Lagos, Nigeria, or in Accra, Ghana, there must be an application by somebody sitting in Tallinn, in Estonia, or San Francisco in the United States, running companies called Taxify or Bolt or Uber. If that is what globalization means, then I don't want globalization. If globalization means that when I am at the airport in Nnamdi Azikiwe Airport in Abuja, or Muritala Mohammed in Lagos, Nigeria, or Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, or Tambo in South Africa, that my food must be prepared and my things must be run by Swissport from Switzerland, if that is what globalization means, then I do not like globalization. If globalization means that Nigeria can produce oil, but that oil cannot be refined in Nigeria, it must be taken by Mobil, by Moxa, by Exxon, by Total, by Elf, then that is not the globalization that I desire. I refuse to accept a globalization that says that diamond is produced in Namibia, in Lesotho, in Botswana, in Sierra Leone, and in Liberia, but the price of diamond is determined in Antwerp in Belgium. I refuse that globalization. I refuse a globalization that says that cocoa is produced in Nigeria. It is produced in Accra in Ghana. It produced in Cote d'Ivoire, but the largest coffee producers are Cadbury in the United States of America, in the United Kingdom, and the largest producers of chocolate are to be found in Switzerland, Godiva, Ferrero, and Lindt. I refuse that globalization. I refuse a globalization that says that when I want to send my letter, it must be DHL based in Bonn in Germany. I refuse that globalization. I refuse a globalization that tells me that when I'm moving money from Otta to Lagos, it must be G4S in the United Kingdom that tells me and provides me with the means of protecting my money. That is the kind of globalization that is being talked about. That is the kind of globalization that we are being told that we must embrace. But you know, the Western world are always ahead of the game. They always look like they love us. In the year 2000, they looked like they loved us. They came up with something called Millennium Development Goals. They were 8 in number. And Africa celebrated, because sometimes we celebrate too soon in Africa. We celebrated that now the world has made only one solemn vow, that Africa will never be a prisoner of poverty, that Africa will never be a prisoner of ignorance, that Africa will never be a prisoner of all the things that have hamstrung us. So they came with the Millennium Development Goals. And those Millennium Development Goals were supposed to run for a course of 15 years. They ended in the year 2015. None of the African countries had satisfied the Millennium Development Goals, except Rwanda, which they say was nearly close to satisfying it. Then they thought again, and they came up with other goals. This time they gave them another name, and they multiplied them and added one. They are now 17. They are called the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are told that if we embrace this thing that is called development goals, then by the year 2030, Africa will be El Dorado, the land of gold. If you think that that is what it will be, you are chasing a mirage. But they don't stop there. It is not only Europe that is thinking about us in those terms. Even the United States of America, in its inexhaustible wisdom, when they sit at the Congress, thought that Africans also needed some help. They came up with what is called the Africa Growth Opportunity Act. One of the things that was to happen with the African Growth Opportunity Act is that we were to create export processing zones, and Africans created export processing zones. If there were no export processing zones in Nairobi, Kenya, making jeans to be worn by America, if there were no export processing zones in different parts of the world, then we were not doing well. We were told that that is how our textile industries would thrive. What we learned later is that once we had made new clothing items and sent them to the United States of America, once the Americans had worn them, they had looked at them and they were not good enough, they would send them back to Africa as second-hand clothing, with the consequence that Africa treats as new that which has been rejected by Europe and America. That is the globalization that we are talking about. So this Africa, this Mother Africa, this Africa of which Martin Meredith talks in his book, The Fortunes of Africa, and says that Africa is the repository of all known wealth. This Africa, how can she have 1 billion people plus and she's the poorest continent on earth? This Africa, how can she be the home of all minerals and she does not make anything? This Africa, how can she be the producer of rare earth to be found in every mobile telephone and she makes not a single mobile telephone? This Africa, how can she be the home of uranium and she does not have a single nuclear power station? This Africa, how can she be the home of iron ore and she does not make a single car except assemble cars? This Africa, how can she be the home of animals, cattle, and produce leather, and yet the shoes worn by her women and by her men are made in Italy? This Africa, how can she be the home of all the medicine, all the plants that are used to make medicine in the world, and yet the medicine that is used to cure our sick sons and daughters are made by Bayer? This Africa, how can she be in that state? She can only be in that state because she understands and misinterprets what globalization is. Globalization is a latter-day Trojan horse which has been modeled in Europe and America to enter into the continent. It is sugar-coated, but below the sugar coat there is a bitter pill. Once you have licked the sweetness on top, you will begin to grapple with the paralyzing poison. Africa, we now know what globalization must not mean. But then what must globalization mean? Because we too must not allow ourselves to go into the paralysis of analysis of our problems. We must, in the nature of things, define ourselves. What do we want as Africa? What do we want to achieve in the world? We know that as Africa we cannot survive without the others. We know that we must relate with the Chinese. But how do we relate with the Chinese, we must ask? We must know that we want to relate with the Americans, but how must we relate with the Americans, we must ask? We know that we must relate with the Arabs, but how must we relate with the Arabs? That is why I'm saying that we Africans must now define for ourselves what globalization means. I'm not the first one to talk about globalization and what she must mean. There are distinguished Africans who have looked at the continent of Africa and have said, Africa must now rethink her position. The great South African writer Greg Mills, in his now famous book, Why Africa is Poor and What They Can Do About It, says, and I agree with him, that poverty is now a choice. Africans, through their leaders, have chosen to be poor. And if they are to liberate themselves from the chains of poverty, they must begin to do things in the right way. Greg Mills says, and I agree, the things that require effort can only be acquired if we make effort. Africans must now make effort. But what kind of effort? I am a Christian and a practicing one. Sometimes we pray and fast for things which prayer and fasting cannot bring. I'm suggesting to us that we must embrace science and technology. I agree with Greg Mills. And it's not only Greg Mills that has talked about what Africa must do. The young Zambian economist Dambisa Felicia Moyo says that for a long time Africa believed that aid was the solution to her problems. We received aid and grants from different parts of the world. It did not solve our problems. Where I come from, we are told that when you are milking a cow that you have borrowed, you must always face the gate when you are milking the cow, because who knows when the owner may come for it. I'm suggesting to us, but we Africa have milked a borrowed cow for too long. Aid is not the solution to Africa's problem. We must look for another avenue. But it's not only Dambisa Moyo that has talked about it. A great Kenyan who has talked about agriculture, called Calestas Juma, in a book which I commend to all of us, The New Harvest, says, Africa can no longer afford the luxury of farming like their ancestors did. You can no longer farm like Adam and Eve did. You can no longer rely on rain-fed agriculture. We must embrace science and technology if we are to feed ourselves. I agree with Calestas Juma. I also agree with a book which has been written recently. It's written by 4 authors. It is written by Greg Mills. It is written by Davis Hubbs. It is written by Jeffrey Davis and your own Chief Dr. Olusegun Obasanjo, Making Africa Work. I am suggesting to us that Africa can work, but Africa will only work if our sons and daughters open their eyes to the realities that I'm talking about. So, ladies and gentlemen, globalization is here with us. Globalization is the thing that we are now talking about. Africa will either swim or drown. But when I look at Africa, if she wants to swim, she must do a number of things. One of the things that Africa must do is that Africa must look at her economy, and Africa must recognize that our countries are divided into small units which in fact are not viable. African countries are presently constituted are not viable. I love Burundi, but Burundi alone is not viable. I love Seychelles, but Seychelles alone is not viable. I love Benin. I love Togo. I love all these little countries, but they are not viable if they were to go it alone. And that is why it gives me joy when I see that Africans have now recognized that going forward, in order to confront globalization, Africa must unite. And it's not unity simply for its own sake. It is unity for the purpose of ensuring that we harness our resources. I was glad, therefore, when in the year 2013, African countries met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And when they met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, they came up with what is called Africa Agenda 2063. Africa Agenda 2063 in and of itself will not solve our problems, but it marks baby and embryonic steps, the recognition by African countries that if Africa is to realize our potential, she must work together. Agenda 2063 is founded on 7 pillars. I will not recite the 7 pillars, but the 7 pillars include the realization by Africa that she can be rich and prosperous. The realization that in order for her to be rich and prosperous, she must have peace. The realization that in order for her to be rich and prosperous, she must have ethics and must respect her culture. The realization by Africa that in order to be rich and prosperous, she must take care of our environment. The realization by Africa that in order to be rich and prosperous, our governance system must improve. The realization by Africa that in order for her to be rich and prosperous, Our women must be given their pride of place because they are over 50% of the population. The realization by Africa that in order for her to be rich and prosperous, she must unite and must move from agriculture that is not mechanized. The realization by Africa that she can no longer rely on primary products, that Africa must add value to our products. The realization by Africa that is only through unity that Agenda 2063 must be recognized. But Africa did not stop there. Africa went further in the year 2017 when they met in Kigali, Rwanda, and they came up with African Continental Free Trade Area. And they recognized that in order to move forward, the artificial borders that were bequeathed to us by the colonizers must only exist for purposes of administration. We must remove tariff and non-tariff barriers. I salute the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But Africa Continental Free Trade Area in and of itself will not solve our problems if Nigeria is quarreling with Benin. It will not solve our problems if Kenya is quarreling with Somalia. It will not solve our problem if Sudan is quarreling with South Sudan. It will not solve our problem if Ethiopia is quarreling with Egypt. In other words, we are saying that if Africa is to realize our potential, Africa must now begin to move in one direction with a clear resolve that the continent can only grow and confront the challenges of globalization as a united front. So, what do I see when I look at globalization and what we must do about globalization? This is what I see. I'm not a Jewish prophet, nor am I related to one. I'm not a Yoruba seer. But when I look through the times, based on the scientific evidence that is available, I have no doubt in my mind that Africa can realize our potential. But Africa will not realize our potential through declarations. Africa will not realize our potential through workshops and seminars and colloquias and symposiums. Africans must move in a different space. Africa must come to institutions such as this to begin to embrace science and technology. I have been reading a book which I commend to all of us. It is a book written by a young South Korean economist called Ha-Joon Chang. The book has the title, The Bad Samaritans. Those of you who are spiritually inclined and read the Bible only know about the Good Samaritan. I'm now submitting to you, courtesy of Ha-Joon Chang, they are bad Samaritans. The bad Samaritans are out there. They do not mean well for Africa. I'm submitting to you that in this world, the world is still, the law of the jungle still prevails. Survival is still for the fittest, and death is for the least suitable. So in order for Africa to grow and to meet the challenges of globalization, Africa must protect herself. I'm therefore submitting that in order to grow, African economies must choose what to allow into their countries and what not to allow. And I'm submitting that if the Nigerian textile industry is to prosper, a decision must be made by Nigeria that certain second-hand clothing will not come to Nigeria. I'm submitting that if Nigeria is to protect her oil, Nigeria must make a solemn vow and a decision that Nigeria will no longer export her crude oil and import oil that is refined. Nigeria must refine her oil so that she also benefits from the byproducts of oil. I'm suggesting that that is what globalization is all about. I'm suggesting that if globalization is to work, then Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and Nigeria must no longer export cocoa in its raw form. They must have factories that are making chocolate in Accra and in Lagos and in Abidjan. I'm saying that that is the only way in which we will have jobs in the domestic arena. I'm submitting to us that we can no longer continue throughout the ages to buy telephone from Samsung in Korea or Techno in China or Apple in the United States of America or Nokia from Finland or from any other part of the world producing cotton, and we do not make phones. I know that the Rwandese have started assembling smartphones, but we must go beyond assembly. This university, including Bell University, must now begin to introduce a technology where phones are made here. We can no longer live in Africa where there is no energy. It surprises and saddens me at once that Iran produces more electricity, has more power than all African countries combined, excluding South Africa. It cannot be right. I'm now suggesting that these universities and others must now collaborate so that we harness the sun, that we can produce solar energy. I'm suggesting that Nigeria or indeed any other African country is not going to reindustrialize if we do not have energy, and we cannot participate in globalization if we are consumers. You know, it is the great Kenyan Ali Mazrui who said, Africa is in the business of producing what she does not consume and consuming what she does not produce. Let us now ensure that Africa produces what she consumes and consumes what she produces. We can trade with the world. So I'm submitting to us that going forward, Africa can only protect herself through trade. And trade will only happen if Africa is strong. How can it be? There is a song that is sung by the Christian brethren. How can it be? Let me sing that song. How can it be that we do not produce any aeroplane? How can it be? How can it be that we do not produce any aeroplane and Brazil produces an aeroplane? How can it be that we produce no car and Korea produces a car? How can it be? How can it be that all of us who are assembled here are wearing shoes made from England and Italy? How can it be? How can it be that even the beautiful dresses that we are wearing are possibly made in the Netherlands? How can it be that even the underwear that we are wearing and the undergarments that our mothers and sisters are wearing are made from elsewhere? How can it be that even the hair that our women are wearing are imported from Korea and India? How can it be? How can it be? How can it be that even when we have worked so hard and we want to consume beer, it is Carlsberg, it is Diageo? How can it be? How can it be that when we have worked so hard and we want to drink water, it's Dasani made by Coca-Cola? How can it be? How can it be that when I think of a soft drink, I think of Fanta and Sprite and Apple Tizer and Coca-Cola? How can it be that palm wine is not being sold worldwide and any attempts at bottling is only in its embryonic stages? How can it be? How can it be that we have universities of science and technology and our politicians do not listen to them? How can it be that when I'm being driven from Abeokuta to Ota, it is the Chinese that are making the roads? How can it be? What happened to the Nigerian engineer? Is the University of Lagos not producing civil engineers? Is the University of Ibadan not producing engineers? Is the University of Maiduguri not producing engineers? How can it be? How can it be that when our leaders are unwell, They don't go to our hospitals. How can it be? Are we not producing doctors? How can it be? Is that what globalization is all about? So much for sorrows and lamentation. But how can it be? I'm of the view that our eyes are now open. Our eyes are now open, and we now know a number of things. We now know that globalization as defined to us by Europe and America and Asia is not necessarily good for us. It is good for them. It is good for them. We now know that globalization will only mean that jobs are created out there and jobs are lost here. We now know that globalization as defined for us will not help us. We now know that globalization as defined for us will always make sure that Africans remain hewers of wood and drawers of water. We must now convert it. We must now define our own globalization. Globalization must now mean that what we produce we will improve. Globalization must now mean that our universities will give pride of place to science and technology. Globalization must now mean that our governments will now allocate money for research and development. Globalization will now mean that the men and women that we elect into public office will no longer think that the ballot box is a magic which converts them into people who have monopoly of wisdom and ideas, and that they must listen to experts. We must now tell ourselves that it can be done and that we are the ones who must do it. We must now tell ourselves that we must have a system that makes Africa work. Africa can work. Africa will work, and it will only work if we Africans choose to work. And this is the time. The time to work is now. Therefore today, if I was a Christian preacher, I would say today is our day of the Pentecost. Let the Holy Spirit of science and technology descend. Let the Holy Spirit of science and technology descend. Let the Holy Spirit of research and development descend. Let the Holy Spirit of a new meaning of globalization descend. Let us say with our words and with our mouth that from today henceforth Africa will not be defined by others. Africa will define herself. Africa knows what she wants. Africa and her sons and daughters are going to move in the right direction, and we shall do what is good, right, and just for us. Africa must rise. Africa will rise, and Africa will stand. God bless you.